Here you got this boy raised in the rural South, at the time of his death in 1925, was one of the richest men in the country. And he got that way through sharp business practices. But that was accepted. I mean, that was very much the Darwinian business world, the survival of the fittest. That's how John D. Rockefeller created Standard Oil, and that's how Andrew Carnegie created United States Steel, and that's how James B. Duke created American tobacco. It was not by being Mr. Nice Guy. That's a quote from author Walter Edgar from a documentary I watched about James Buchanan Duke, titled From Poverty to Power, The James B. Duke Story. It was not by being Mr. Nice Guy. We'll revisit that phrase at the end of this episode, but what led me to James Buchanan Duke was my interest and curiosity in the Ty Cobb T-206 baseball cards. So I read a book that was referred to me by a friend who insisted I'd enjoy it. So I read Ty Cobb, A Terrible Beauty by Charles Leerhsen, and I was blown away by the book. If you're a baseball fan, you have to check out this book. I know you'll love it. But along the way, I also learned more about the legendary T-206 baseball cards that have become so valuable over the years. And of course, that journey sent me directly to James Buchanan Duke, who was at the helm of the American Tobacco Company and the same company who created the T-206 baseball cards. So before I get into Charles Leerhsen's book on Ty Cobb, we really need to look at James B. Duke, and I think you'll find the timeline of Ty Cobb and the American Tobacco Company really interesting because they intersect. So reading about James Duke and Ty Cobb, I noticed some similarities: an unconventional mindset, a fearlessness, and a drive, a passion to be the best. A mindset that created the largest tobacco monopoly in the world, and a mindset that created one of the greatest baseball players to ever live. And at virtually the same exact instant, these two forces collide, creating one of the greatest baseball cards in the world, the Ty Cobb T-206. So we need to start with Duke. And I read a book called The Dukes of Durham, written by Robert Franklin Durden. And the book, first published in 1975, chronicles the Duke family. Father Washington Duke and his two sons, Ben and James Buchanan Duke, as it began from basically nothing after the Civil War ended to growing the largest tobacco company in the world. So James B. Duke, taking over his father's company, he had worked for him since he was 14 years old, and now he's looking to grow the business. He's still a young man, but he's learning the business and he wants to grow it. At this exact same time, there's a big race to build a machine that will roll cigarettes without the need for hand rolling. So saving labor costs, manual labor costs of rolling cigarettes, there's a hunt and a race to build a machine that will do it instead. So that's exactly what James Duke knows that he needs and he wants. And now he's out to find this machine for his company, and he finds it. It's called the Bonsack cigarette machine. And so the machine would be leased by Duke. And now we're going to start in on the book, The Dukes of Durham, and it's going to explain a little bit about this Bonsack machine. So this is from the book. The Bonsack Machine Company, the joint stock company which had been organized to produce and handle the invention, leased the machines on a royalty basis of approximately 2/3 of the cost of producing cigarettes by hand. In other words, the Bonsack Company charged 30 cents per 1,000 cigarettes for plain work and 33 cents per 1,000 for printed work, with the Bonsack Company installing the machine and furnishing an operator for it. So this Bonsack machine rolled cigarettes automatically without the labor-intensive hand rolling. So Duke finds this machine. The machine didn't work so well at the start, but he found a mechanic who knew how to keep this machine running. His name was William T. O'Brien. And so he kind of has this ace mechanic in his pocket, William T. O'Brien, who keeps this machine, figures out how to run this machine. So James Duke, he knew the Bonsack machine was the future, but he had to deal with a couple of his partners in the business who didn't want to grow as fast as him and didn't really understand what the future was for the tobacco industry. So he had to deal with them, and basically he had to get rid of these partners. So he took care of business. He got rid of those partners who weren't interested in this growth and this automated future. And now he can focus on making a deal, and a deal of the lifetime it would end up being, but he can make this deal for the Bonsack machine. So to the Dukes of Durham book, they explain this deal. The ambitious partners of the Duke Company, especially James B. Duke, were nevertheless ready by 1885 to take a large gamble and give the cigarette machine invented by James A. Bonsack of Virginia more than just a casual try. W. Duke, Sons and Company would be the first manufacturers of cigarettes to take such a step, and it would pay off handsomely, even if no one could know that for a certainty in 1885. So they're going to make a deal for this Bonsack machine. And the book keeps going and it explains the details of this deal, which would end up being key to James Duke. And so this is Strauss from the Bonsack Machine Company. A guy named Strauss is who Duke is dealing with. Strauss, for his part, agreed that the rate of royalty on the machines at the Duke factory should at once be reduced from 33 cents per thousand for printed cigarettes and 30 for unprinted ones to 24 cents per thousand on all cigarettes. Furthermore, when and if all cigarettes produced by the Duke firm were made by the machines, the rate would be reduced to 20 cents per thousand. And finally, if the Bonsack rate of royalty to any other manufacturer should ever be reduced below the standard rate of 33 cents and 30 cents respectively, W. Duke, Sons and Company should have its rate proportionately reduced so that it would always be charged 25% less than any other manufacturer. So James B. Duke just makes a deal of a lifetime. He just struck up a huge deal for his company, a rate that would be always 25% less than his competitors for this machine. So any other manufacturer that uses the machine will pay at least 25% more for it. Duke could now undercut his competition all the way down to nothing if he wanted. So he now has a huge advantage. So the cost for the machine rolled tobacco fell and consumers started buying more of it. So prices are falling for the consumer and they're buying more and more tobacco. So competition heats up, sales are increasing. And of course, Duke has the upper hand and the competitors are starting to realize this. So to compete, now tobacco companies began printing colorful advertisements and portrait cards to insert into the cigarette packs as marketing. And these would become all different types of cards, but baseball cards were one of those types of cards now that they would print. Baseball was beginning to gain in popularity after the Civil War. And so as competition for sales is heating up, big producers of tobacco began printing colorful advertisements and portrait cards to insert into their cigarette packs. So now the industry is growing and now the ability to buy out his competition now becomes clear. And he convinces his big competitors to join his trust, which is going to be the American Tobacco Company or the ATC. And his competitors really had no choice. They knew they were cooked if they didn't join up with Duke once they realized that deal that he had made for the Bonsack machine. So now the trust has been created with these largest producers of tobacco led by Duke. And so now they have a monopoly. They have a huge market share. They have about 90% of the market captured in this trust. So there's no more need for the marketing, the expensive color printed cards that inserted into the packs of cigarettes. So there's really no need for that. There's no more competition, basically. So they get rid of the printed cards. Like baseball cards go away actually when this monopoly is formed for several years. So if you think that James B. Duke wasn't tough, let me give you an example. He rose to the top of this industry by making these business deals for the Bonsack machine. But once he's formed his trust, he had to deal with running a monopoly, which is not the easiest thing in the world. There was an uprising, a civil unrest. It was called the Black Patch Tobacco Wars, where the smaller tobacco farmers and companies, they were protesting the power of this newly created monopoly by Duke and the American Tobacco Company because they were undercutting their prices. And these smaller farmers had no shot at competing. And they began to riot. They began to use violence because they just didn't have anywhere else to turn. So James B. Duke, very tough, very ambitious, very creative deal maker, smart as anyone, and he's always looking for an edge in his industry. And so that starts to sound a whole lot like Ty Cobb, who I read a book about called A Terrible Beauty by Charles Leerhsen. And so now we have to jump over to Cobb. Before we go too far with James B. Duke, we're going to go a couple 100 miles south down the road from Durham, North Carolina, where Duke is running his operation in the tobacco industry. And we're going to travel down to Augusta, Georgia. So right about this same time in 1900, while this tobacco trust is dominating the industry, in the year 1900, there is a young Ty Cobb, and he's about 14 years old down the road in Augusta, Georgia. So I read the book, Ty Cobb, A Terrible Beauty by Charles Leerhsen, and it's awesome. The book covers the entire life of Ty Cobb, but it also really does a great job at dispelling many of the rumors and the made-up stories of Ty Cobb that were written over the years. And many of those were written by one particular sports writer named Al Stump. And Stump was a sports writer back in the day. He helped Cobb on his autobiography just before Cobb died. And then 3 decades later, Al Stump wrote a book that painted Ty Cobb in probably the worst light you could imagine. And many of the stories that he wrote in that book were proved false or embellished or made up. And Stump himself admitted to just straight up making up many of the details in his book. So that's how great crazy sports writer makes up a bunch of stories about an athlete and writes a book about it. That's not that unthinkable. But the problem is with this particular book is that Al Stump's book also happened to be the same book used by a Hollywood producer named Ron Shelton, who made a 1994 film called Cobb, starring Tommy Lee Jones. You may have seen this movie or heard about it, but the movie and the script was based off of Al Stump's book that he wrote, or mostly fictitious book. And now you have a Hollywood produced movie with Tommy Lee Jones, Hollywood star, in it, representing completely made up stories. So what led me to this book by Charles Leerhsen is his defense of Ty Cobb in some of these stories that have been proven to be completely false or made up. And he does a great job in outlining that. And then he also gives a complete story of Ty Cobb. So let's check out this book. It was awesome. I loved it. And so let's start with a description by Leerhsen of a young Ty Cobb right at this 1900 time period. If you remember, we were talking about James B. Duke dominating his tobacco industry up the road in Durham, North Carolina, right at the year 1900. We'll go down back to Augusta, Georgia, and we'll go to Leerhsen's book. He describes a young Ty Cobb, 14, 15 years old. The skinny lad who always seemed to be tossing up stones and whacking them with sticks, had become known as a bare-knuckled battler. You saw it the minute you set eyes on him, said a childhood friend of a young Ty's hair-trigger temperament. So he's going to explain a little bit about the makeup of Cobb, and he gives a few different examples. Here's another one from his book, and this is a quote from Ty Cobb himself later on. He's looking back at himself as a youngster. He says, but even Cobb admitted in one interview to having a vying nature, and in a seemingly heartfelt memoir serialized in newspapers in 1914, he allowed that he had a terrible temper in my younger days, and it got me into a lot of trouble. So that was Ty Cobb admitting that he did have a terrible temper, and it got him into a lot of trouble. That's a understatement. And now we can look at one more account of a young Ty Cobb from another friend of his from Leerhsen's book. There is no denying that Cobb was a born battler. Just as some people seem to come into the world as jokesters, wimps, loners, or bores, the quality was striking to those who knew and liked him. As his friend Grantland Rice wrote in his memoir, The Tumult and the Shouting, when I first met Cobb, I found him to be an extremely peculiar soul, brooding and bubbling with violence, combative all the way, a streak incidentally he never lost. So there's another example of a friend of his when he was a kid. You saw it, you noticed it right away. The Cobb, he was different. He was a different kid. He had an edge to him, and people knew it. A temper, stubborn, and he just feisty was a lot of the stories of when he was younger. But now he's figuring out the game of baseball. Baseball is getting popular, and he's working hard trying to figure this game out as a youngster. And he has success. He's getting better and better. And now he's making it into the minor leagues as a youngster. And the book goes into his development as a baseball player. Cobb changed himself dramatically as a hitter in the early months of 1898. I had the gift of being able to appraise myself, even at that age of 12. He said 2 decades later, it had been the greatest asset of my life. All his life, in articles and after dinner introductions, people would describe Cobb as a natural, thinking that they were paying the supreme compliment, and he would respond that he was anything but. The feistiness of Cobb comes out again. He's talking about people trying to give him a compliment as being a natural. You say, well, if somebody's really talented, you say they're a natural. And he would stop people and correct them. And he would say, I'm anything but that, because he knew the hard work that he had put in and just the toughness and the hard work that it took to be good at this game of baseball. And so this is Cobb now explaining how he became great. And he realized that it was confidence. To be great, he had to be confident. And this is from the book. When I was 12 years old, I knew pretty well what I could do as a ball player, he said at age 39. Besides the snap swing and the split grip, he now had confidence, by far the single most important attribute for any athlete he would always maintain. So he knows he needed to be confident, and he had it. He knows that's pretty much all he needs to be great. And, similar to James B. Duke, as a young kid working in the factory for his father at age 14, they're learning these same lessons as they're in their younger years that they're going to use the rest of their life. So Ty Cobb grows stronger, he battles, he figures out the game of baseball, and he runs into an unlikely mentor while in the minor leagues. And I like this story because it's a turning point that Cobb talks about later on in his life. He tells this story that I had never heard before, and it's fascinating. Here's the start of the story from the book. By helping to scotch a trade that would have sent Cobb to Indiana, she put the troubled 18-year-old on a path to encounter George Leidy, the man he would always credit with saving his career from a premature demise. George O. Leidy never made it to the major leagues, and he cut such a narrow swath through the bushes that it's impossible to describe him in great detail. Contemporary reports note that he was of medium height with gnarled knuckles, for whatever that may be worth to your imagination. Even I, at this point, probably one of America's foremost George O. Leidy experts, cannot tell you what the O stood for. He's an enigma wrapped in an Augusta tourist uniform. Cobb said he had a southern drawl, but Leidy was born and raised in New Jersey. So this is Leerhsen, the author, talking about this character that pops up in the book, George O. Leidy. And he didn't even know what the O, his middle initial, stood for. He was just this mystery man, but he did have gnarled knuckles, if that means anything to you. So I'm sure this had something to do with Cobb maybe becoming friends with this guy Leidy. Just seems like an interesting character. But let's keep going in this story. Ty Cobb, this is a minor league game, and Ty Cobb is screwing around in the outfield. He missed a fly ball in the outfield because he was actually snacking on popcorn. During the game, he missed a fly ball. So Leidy sees this and he wants to sit down and talk about it with Cobb. This is from Leerhsen's book now. Leidy had his first talk with Cobb on the evening of the day that Roth benched him for snacking in the outfield. The wonderful old man, as Cobb remembered his 36-year-old teammate, took him on a streetcar ride to an amusement park on the outskirts of Augusta, where they strolled the gaslit grounds and talked. Leidy, quote, wasn't angry, just disappointed, Cobb recalled. Baseball, he said, was a great game. It had unlimited opportunities for a boy who knew how to play. Eating popcorn in the outfield was all right if you thought the game was just a joke. But suppose you were too ambitious for that kind of horseplay. Suppose you kept your eye on the ball, studied, practiced, learned to make the most of what nature had given you. You could go to towns that would make Augusta look like a crossroads. You could be famous. You could make a fortune. And every boy in America would idolize you. Your name would go down in the history books. That night was a turning point, Cobb said. I made up my mind to be a big leaguer if it killed me. So let's keep going. Leerhsen keeps explaining this story of Leidy. Obviously, a huge moment for Cobb looking back. This was a turning point, he says, to Leerhsen's book. Leidy's gospel was nothing more complicated than practice makes perfect, but he thought in terms of hundreds, if not thousands of hours of repetitive drills. Christy Mathewson wasn't always a great pitcher, he told Cobb that evening at the amusement park. When he started out, he had very poor control, so he'd go to the park early and take along a catcher. He'd have the catcher hold his glove in one position and try to hit the hollow of the glove with every pitch. In the winter, he'd cut a hole about twice as big as a baseball, about the height of an average man's waist, in the side of his barn, and he'd pitch for hours trying to throw the ball through the hole. Moving on to Hannes Wagner, the era's other major star, Leidy recounted a strange story about how the burly shortstop, eager to get a better jump on ground balls, would dig trenches and set himself in those trenches in his stocking feet to get a better start. Even if some of Leidy's lessons left Cobb scratching his head, the moral of every tale he told was, you gotta keep pegging at one certain thing until you got it down pat. And that's Leerhsen's account in his book. He ends this Leidy story with one more excerpt. So let's go to Leerhsen's book again. At the conclusion of all that life-changing lecture, Leidy advised Ty to meet him early next morning at Warren Park and to bring a sweater. Cobb, for all his desire to explore the limits of the game, was not yet a good bunter. So the older man put the plumped-up cardigan just inside the first baseline, about 40 feet from home plate, and tossed Cobb baseballs so he could practice drag bunting into it. So this guy Leidy takes Cobb under his wing and is helping him perfect this craft. He has a talk. He sits him down. He has the big talk with him. Now he's actually working with him the next day on his bunting skills. And like Cobb said, it was a turning point in his life. Shortly after that, Cobb makes it to the major leagues. So it didn't take long for him to snap into gear. No more snacking on popcorn. No more screwing around. He wanted to make it to the big leagues if it killed him. And it wasn't long. And he's in the big leagues. So he's playing for the Detroit Tigers. He makes an impression when he joins the Tigers, but maybe too much of an impression because the other players are jealous. His teammates are probably jealous. Cobb doesn't really fit in as one of the guys. He's a new kid, but he just doesn't fit in with the group. He doesn't hang with the boys. He's not one of the guys. And the hazing and the bullying begin for Cobb. And of course, Cobb's not taking anything from anyone, not even bullying from professional baseball players. So he really struggles with the bullying and the hazing. Leerhsen goes into detail on this phase of Cobb's early days in the major leagues. While he's trying to deal with just getting into the majors, he also realizes that he needs to study and learn from these other pro players. So he's taking cues from them on how to play hard. And here's a great example of Cobb just absorbing everything he's experiencing. He tells a story about an opposing player tagging Cobb extremely hard during a game. And so from Leerhsen's book, he didn't just tag Cobb with McGuire's perfect peg. He brought his knee down on the back of Cobb's neck and pushed his face into the barely concealed hay market cobbles. My forehead and face were shoved into the hard ground and the skin peeled off just above my eyebrows, Cobb recalled in his 1925 memoir. But as painful as the experience was, he did not come up swinging. His feelings were not injured. The clever way in which he moved completely blocked me, Ty wrote. When I got to my feet, I was much subdued. I had run into a real big leaguer. I realized that he knew much of what I would have to learn. So Cobb wants to be great, and he's finding out he just ran into a real big leaguer. He says, these are the pros now, and he's going to pull everything he can from these opposing players and from his teammates. He's going to start to learn very, very quickly, and he wants to be the best. He wants to be great. At the same time, he's got to deal with his teammates now and all this other garbage that comes along with being the new guy in a group of people who are jealous of your skills and who you don't fit in with. They're going to start constant trouble for Cobb. And so Leerhsen goes into this now. As a flaneur and a constant reader, he especially liked biographies of Jefferson and Napoleon. Cobb was often away from his teammates, though he sometimes played cards with Germany Schaefer, Bill Donovan, and a few others. Some veterans resented Cobb's apparent aloofness, but perhaps because he was so infrequently around those men, he didn't immediately sense their feelings. So Cobb's just he's dialed into what he's doing. He's not paying attention to all the cliques and the groups of his teammates, but they're watching it. And now Leerhsen starts to go into a few of these examples of his teammates now are starting to target him. By then, though, a sea change had occurred on the Tigers, making the innocent days of late winter seem far away indeed. Cliques were constantly forming and disbanding in that cranky cottonmouth clubhouse. But it was the dramatic realignment of certain players in opposition to Cobb in the early spring of 1906 that would have a dramatic effect on the team for years to come and on Cobb himself forever. So he's going to deal with a hard time breaking into the major leagues, making a good impression with his skills and his talent, wanting to be the best, not putting in any time worrying about his teammates in the group and fitting in. And Leerhsen goes into some of the treatment that he had to deal with. It was really hard for Cobb, and he talked about it later on in his life, and it was always really, really hard for him. Obviously still painful, and for Cobb to go back and even talk about later after his career. So Leerhsen goes into a story where he was actually blocked, like physically blocked by a veteran player to take batting practice before a game. And this is kind of the start of trouble for Cobb among his teammates. But that day, his anger seemed to have no precipitating cause. Cobb said he was shocked by McIntyre's behavior, and employing the most obscene terms, he informed Ty that he wouldn't be taking any batting practice. Not that day, perhaps not ever. If Cobb wanted to occupy himself, McIntyre said, he could run around in the outfield and shag fly balls hit by the veterans. Or better yet, pack his bags and return to the second-rate Southern minors from whence he slithered. A half year behind schedule, but with no power lost for being pent up for so long, the hazing of Ty Cobb had begun. And so Leerhsen goes into detail on Cobb's teammates would start fights with him. They would make stuff up about him, antagonizing him basically. And they would saw his wood bats in half and leave them at his locker, laying in his locker, half cut up bats. They would steal his clothing. They would mess with his uniform, just constant bullying from his older teammates. Here's another example from Leerhsen. One didn't have to be as emotionally fragile unusual as Cobb, though, to be hurt by what Matty McIntyre and his ilk were doing. The hazing he received in 1906 was long and brutal. Cobb thought about it night and day and later recalled that it left him with, quote, a heavy burning inside. They sort of formed a gang which kept aloof from me, he wrote. They clearly made me feel my position, that of a recruit. I had no place in their councils. I had to go about alone. He was still technically a teenager, newly fatherless, far from home. Other players had gone through struggles as hard, he wrote, but none harder. So Leerhsen wraps up this part of the book on the early days of Cobb making it to the majors. And he points out that a lot of the players they would justify their own actions. They'd say, this is from Leerhsen's book, but his defiant attitude was enough to keep his tormentors at their task. Some, like Sam Crawford, thought any excesses on the part of the anti-Cobb clique were basically Cobb's fault. He took it the wrong way, Crawford said, sounding what was at the time a popular refrain. He came up with an antagonistic attitude, which in his mind turned any little razzing into a life or death struggle. So teammates just saying, look, he doesn't even know how to deal with it. If he would have just ignored it, he would have been fine, but he fought back and he just brought it on himself. And that's not the way Leerhsen paints it in the book. It was completely out of line, and he was mistreated in his early days. But at the same time, by now, he's a fighter. Cobb does not suffer fools, ever. Even if he's a new guy on a baseball team, the newest player, he's not going to put up with anything. And that's just the way it is. And here's one more summary about the hazing that he received. A basic question arises. Was Cobb thriving despite the turmoil that surrounded him? The ostracism, the broken bats and hats, the wads of wet newspaper, or because of it? This is not a simple question. And whatever the answer, we do know that he was not a man able to block things out. It was impossible to talk to people who knew him and come away with the sense that he ever slipped and rolled with life's punches. Rather, he led with his chin. This tendency may have been rooted in the same southernness that aggravated his fellow Tigers. And here's just another example of Cobb's toughness and his feistiness from Leerhsen's book. Cobb was learning something about himself that spring. Despite his Irish bloodlines, he was the kind of person who would rather have the wind in his face than at his back. I like opposition, he would observe years later. The many extra challenges he endured that spring and beyond seemed to help bolster his will and focus his mind. His great talent was not blocking out adversity, but letting it come through, unfiltered, and turning it into fuel. As Cobb's favorite historical figure, Napoleon Bonaparte, said, adversity is the midwife of genius. Connie Mack once put it another way. Don't get Cobb mad. Anger made him better. When the hazing players would get me angry and upset by some petty act, Cobb said, I often gritted my teeth and declared to myself that I would get a base hit the next time up or die in the attempt. In this way, he made his enemies and his worries complicit in his quest for greatness. Whatever did not kill Cobb would make him a 350 hitter and some years a 400 one. So Cobb overcomes. Great writing by Leerhsen. I love his descriptive writing. And Cobb becomes a star. Very quickly in the next few seasons, he's the new star of the team. Cobb would hit over 400 in 3 different seasons, but he became the star, and he's going to rise beyond the star of the Tiger team, and now he's going to go beyond that, and now he's going to become the superstar. So this is from Leerhsen's book. He was starting to become involved in myriad sideline schemes. He would soon own a Hupmobile dealership in Augusta. He became perhaps the first athlete ever to trademark and license his signature, initially to a company that made athletic shoes, including spikes. He purchased stock in the Augusta Chronicle and endorsed Post Toasties. So Post Toasties are some kind of breakfast food, it looks like. And then he says, at 22, Cobb was the key figure in what was quickly becoming a cultural and commercial juggernaut. So superstar status, nationwide, endorsement deals. He ended up becoming friends with the CEO of Coca-Cola, loads up on Coca-Cola stock at one point, which would grow to become a multi-million dollar part of his stock portfolio. So Cobb is now the most popular baseball player in the world, and his play on the field is what's driving that. He's just tearing up the league with tons of success. So here's Leerhsen. Cobb was playing with panache now, trying to explain why such a fierce opponent could have followers in rival cities. Haywood Brown of the New York Morning Telegraph said it was because he gave them more for their hard-earned ticket than any man alive or dead. In Detroit, he was as big a celebrity as Henry Ford and much more exciting. At home against St. Louis in late April, he stretched a single into a double with a pretty fadeaway slide. Then, when second baseman Jimmy Williams bounced the ball hard in frustration for missing the tag, he scampered onto third, where he slid in safely and drew a standing ovation. By mid-May, he was hitting .365. So Cobb tearing it up for the home fans, tearing it up for the visiting fans in other cities, and they're giving him standing ovations for stealing bases and just making his opposition just look like fools. And you can see this obsession and this desire to be great. And Leerhsen describes his mindset a little bit. On long train trips, he would sit by himself looking out the window, morosely cataloging things he could have done better in the last and plotting surprises for the next. I would think, I haven't tried to score from second base on a bunt in a while. Maybe they think I've given up trying, and I would try that the next day. So Cobb's not worried about hanging with the boys. He sits by himself looking out the window on the train, just plotting and trying to figure out this game. And then so many stories. Leerhsen's book has so many stories of confrontations, the feistiness, altercations, fights. It's full. It's packed full. The book is packed full of confrontation by Cobb. And it's just his drive and it's his personality that just does not stop. Just relentless and feisty. So here's an example of these confrontations he was constantly finding himself in. While it was true that he seldom, if ever, threw the first punch in a brawl, I don't believe Cobb ever picked a fight just for the sake of a row, said Walter Johnson. But start something unfair and you'll get a fight, whether you're a ball player or a taxi driver. He did have an exquisitely short fuse. Today he's often tissed for the quality, yet many in his day found his explosiveness entertaining. To a degree, it humanized a virtuoso who played baseball spookily well, and because he provided such a dizzying array of examples to choose from, fights with complete strangers, fights with teammates, fights with rival players, fights with hotel employees, shopkeepers, and rowdy cranks and such, it also made him, as the expression goes, larger than life. So larger than life is Cobb now. He's finding himself in the middle of trouble everywhere he turns because he will not back down. He's not going to suffer fools. I like that phrase for him. He just does not give in, and he's going to be Cobb no matter what. He's not going to listen to any flack from anyone, whether it's a taxi driver or a hotel employee or a teammate or a rival player. And Leerhsen goes through every one of those stories that have been documented, that are well documented and not made up, but they're in there. They happened. And then, like, this is another example of Cobb being Cobb. He was going to be Cobb no matter what. And here's another story, his wedding story. Cobb was doing things because he could. He was Ty Cobb. From Leerhsen's book, is it superfluous to say that Ty Cobb never did things the easy way? Even his wedding was tangled in controversy, not about the fact of it or the bride he took, but about the timing. I mean, it's fine to get married in the middle of a pennant race, just so long as you, the groom, are not probably the key figure in that race's outcome. Ty Cobb got married in Georgia at the end of August during a pennant race. The Tigers were trying to win the pennant, and Cobb goes missing to get married. Why? Because he can. He's Ty Cobb. He's going to do what he wants, but he's the greatest hitter of them all. And here's Leerhsen talking about that. TYRUS Raymond Cobb was the greatest hitter of them all. His .366 lifetime average over 23 and a half seasons, still the highest ever recorded. This achievement is not traceable simply to superior hand-eye coordination. What it shows most vividly is that Cobb understood how to hit in his particular baseball moment, just as Adrian, Anson, and George Herman Ruth, the offensive stars who bracketed him historically, understood how best to approach the discouraging art in theirs. So he's saying in their time, in Babe Ruth's time and Adrian Anson's time, they understood how to play given the time period. And Cobb dominated at the plate, on the base pass. And Leerhsen gives some more examples. His bag of tricks contained actual tricks. Cobb sometimes slid into second, howled in pain, asked for time, limped around, winced, howled some more, and then lit out for third on the very next pitch. More central to his maddening running style, though, were his powers of observation, which could be employed from a stationary position. So he outsmarted, outworked, out-hustled, out-thought his opponents every day, all day long. And here's some praise now from Leerhsen, goes into some praise from his opponents and teammates. And in the book, it's packed full of Cobb praise from players, from friends, from opponents, teammates. Here's an example of that. But this book is packed with quotes from Ty Cobb's counterparts. Cobb was the roughest, toughest player I ever saw. A tear on the base paths, said Schotten. He was not dirty, though. I never saw him spike a player deliberately. But if you ever got in the way of his flying spikes, brother, you were a dead turkey. That's one of his teammates, this guy Schotten, whoever that is, either a teammate or an opponent, saying Cobb wasn't dirty, but don't get in the way of his flying spikes or you're a dead turkey. So it's great. And there's a lot of good examples in the book of praise, praise of Cobb from people who were there, right there, playing against him. Many of these players and opponents were in melees and in fights and got spiked by Cobb, and they'd say, no, he wasn't dirty. I was in the wrong spot. I was in his way. And there's a lot of accounts of that. Now let's look at the cards. So the legendary T-206 Ty Cobb cards made by the American Tobacco Company. Now this is what joins this whole thing together. We have James B. Duke with a 90% market share up the road in Durham, North Carolina. We have Ty Cobb now dominating the national pastime of baseball and rising to be the greatest player in the world, larger than life. Both of these people that we just read about, James B. Duke, TYRUS Cobb, they are both larger than life at the top of their chosen fields. And what is created by these two is these Ty Cobb T-206 cards. So many of you are familiar with the T-206 Honus Wagner. It's called the Holy Grail of sports cards. I'm not going to get into it. I'm going to do a whole separate episode on Honus Wagner and that card. But the T-206 Ty Cobb cards are also some of the most valuable sports cards in the world. So we come together with these two larger than life figures, and it's 1911. So we just went through 10 or 11 years. James B. Duke rises to the top, creates his monopoly, his trust. And by 1900, he had absolute power over his industry. Then we saw Ty Cobb rise from a 14-year-old in 1900 all the way up to the top, the greatest baseball player to ever play the game. Now it's 1911. Ty Cobb hit a career high batting average of .419 in 1911. He won his first MVP award. He led the league in hits, led the league in stolen bases, RBIs, doubles, triples, and runs scored. And the American Tobacco Company is broken up by the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, something that has been in the works since 1908, but it's officially ruled in 1911. And on that same day, the U.S. government ordered Standard Oil to dissolve. They broke up the American Tobacco Company into 4 separate companies, 4 separate competitors. So leading up to this breakup, they knew it was coming for several years, and the American Tobacco Company and these 4 competitors now have to compete again, and they have to get their marketing budget back out. They have to start printing cards again. They have to start marketing and competing for business. And the playbook that they had run before they had this monopoly, now they pull back out, and they need to start printing portrait cards and sliding them into packs, trying to lure the consumer in buying their product. So with baseball now as popular as it had ever been, and a superstar Ty Cobb hitting .419 and captivating the crowds everywhere he went, we have the creation of the 1909 through 1911 T-206 American Tobacco Company baseball cards. Before we get to Ty Cobb's baseball cards, you might be wondering, well, what happened to James Buchanan Duke? They busted his company up. What happened to Duke? He's doing just fine. After getting his monopoly busted by President Theodore Roosevelt, he goes on to start Duke Energy, an electric power conglomerate. He's going to be fine. He also ends up leaving a massive financial gift to a school in Durham, North Carolina named Trinity College. And that school would later be renamed to Duke University. So let's look at the cards. There's 4 different fronts on these T-206 Ty Cobb cards. So one features a Ty Cobb portrait with a red background. There's another that features the same portrait with a green background. The third variation is called the bat on shoulder card, showing Cobb in his batting stance. There's a 4th card showing Cobb in his batting stance with the bat slightly off his shoulder. So it's called the bat off shoulder card. So there's a handful of these cards with the red background. They're graded at a PSA 8 and they're worth a few $100,000 each. There's just one PSA 8 graded Cobb card with the green background, and that's worth $300,000 to $400,000. The bat on shoulder card has 4 cards graded PSA 8, and so the PSA 8 is the highest grade of this card. There's 4 of them, and that card with the bat on the shoulder is worth a couple $100,000. And the bat off shoulder card has 3 PSA 9 graded cards worth several $100,000 each as well. So those are the 4 T-206 cards, but we're not done. The controversial Ty Cobb T-206 card, and it's fitting that there's a controversy with a T-206 Ty Cobb card because it's a Ty Cobb card. And there's one more. It has the same Cobb portrait on the front as the red background card that we just talked about, but the back of the card says Ty Cobb, King of the Smoking Tobacco World. On the back, it's an advertisement. That's unlike any other T-206 card. So this card's the most rare by far of any of the Cobb T-206 cards, and it's even by far more rare than the Hannes Wagner card that everybody calls the Holy Grail, which there's about 80 to 90 of those cards that are known. There's only about 20 of these Ty Cobb T-206 controversial Ty Cobb King of the Smoking World cards that are known. There's only 20. It's the only T-206 card of all the players with this Ty Cobb tobacco advertisement on the back. The front has a glossy finish. No other T-206 card has this glossy finish. And it's also a little bit of a mystery why the card was made. It looks like Ty Cobb made a deal or endorsement for this particular brand of tobacco. And of course, many hardcore baseball card T-206 collectors are not even sure that it belongs in the same T-206 classification. The case for including the card as part of the T-206 set is 1, they use the exact same portrait photo as the regular Cobb cards. 2, they were issued at the exact same time as all the other T-206 cards, and the card was issued by FR Penn, which was a tobacco company that was acquired by the American Tobacco Company conglomerate in 1903 as part of the trust. So it makes sense that this card is part of the T-206. The only reason that you want to rule it as not part of the set is just because of the back, for the strange back. But this card, there's one single PSA 4.5 graded card, and it's worth about $1 million. It sold a few years ago for almost $1 million. And it was just in 2016 when there was 7 of these cards were discovered at a house somewhere around the Georgia area. And then an 8th card was discovered by the same family 2 years after that. So 8 of these cards were discovered in 2016. So there used to be only 11 or 12 of these cards, and then suddenly now there's 20. So there's 8 more discovered. And they call that the Lucky 7 find is what those cards are labeled. And one of those Lucky 7 find cards is the PSA 4.5, the highest graded example, and the one that's worth almost $1 million. And so here's a great summary from Ty Cobb of his career that he said later on in his later years. And this is in Charles Leerhsen's book. This summarizes things great. This is Ty Cobb. The good book says, turn the other cheek, he said, trying to sound chipper. But I never believed in that much. It doesn't prove out. I happen to have believed more in an eye for an eye when I played baseball, he said with a forced chuckle. He was playing a role. I could forgive him for this. The truth was complicated, and he was a very tired man. Truth wasn't necessarily what people really wanted anyways. Cobb didn't live long enough to see The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, but he understood the most famous line from it. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And that's from Charles Leerhsen's book. And this is why I chose the opening quote of this episode. It describes the life of James Buchanan Duke and his rise to the top of the industry. And the author who said it in that documentary added at the end of his quote, "It was not by being Mr. Nice Guy." And that's a great theme of the episode. The opening quote said, Duke rose to the top through sharp business practices, and it was survival of the fittest. You could say the exact same thing about Cobb. Survival of the fittest. He did what he felt he needed to do, and doing it their own way, no matter what it took. So if you're a big Ty Cobb fan or collector or T-206 expert, I'd love to talk to you about these cards if you have some, or if you're looking to locate them. I highly encourage you to read Charles Leerhsen's book, Ty Cobb, A Terrible Beauty. He's really trying to set the record straight from the decades of stories and just made up things about Ty Cobb, trying to diminish his life, basically. Leerhsen really has a ton of research that he put into his book, trying to set the record straight. At the end of his book, he completely dismantles the credibility of Al Stump, that sports writer who wrote that awful book that was turned into a Hollywood movie. And he also contacted the director of that movie, that Hollywood movie, Ron Shelton. The author, Leerhsen, actually contacted him over email. Shelton admitted in an email to completely making up some of those scenes for his movie with no basis or truth to them, just because they felt like it would be something that Cobb might have done. So Leerhsen has really dismantled a few people, had made some things up about Cobb. I really hope that I've inspired you, convinced you, motivated you to get out there and have some fun. Explore the T-206 series. Encourage you to check out the history of baseball back in the early 1900s. It was a crazy, crazy time. And Ty Cobb was right there dominating, hitting 400, winning 6 MVP awards in a row or whatever it was. I think he won 6 or 7 batting titles in a row from like 1909 to 1915 or 16, something crazy like that. He stole home like 51 times, which is an all-time baseball record that still stands. And I think the next player in second place in that world record is like 21 short of his mark. So it's just a crazy record that is hard to imagine anyone's going to steal home 51 times in their career like Cobb. So get out there, check these things out, look at the T-206 card series. So get out there and have some fun. And I hope that you want to now learn more.